Hello, welcome back, everyone, to the Michael Sisco Show. We're welcoming to the show today author Sean Patrick Hazlett. Did I say that right?
Hazlett, but close
Haz-
enough.
Hazlett. I haven't messed a name up in a while, so we were due. So, but welcome to the show. If you could, while I set up super chats, could you kind of introduce yourself and your background to the audience?
Sure. So my name is Sean Patrick Hazlett. I'm a writer and an editor, mostly science fiction, fantasy, and horror. I'm also a military veteran. I spent about 5 years training U.S. forces for the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan as what is known as the opposing forces. So while I was there, the last peer competitor that we had in terms of doctrine and tactics was the Soviet Union. So I became an expert on Soviet doctrine and tactics, and that experience has played into an anthology that I was just released by Baen Books in the past 2 weeks called Weird World War III. It answers the alternative historical question: what if the Soviet Union and the United States had fought World War III? And it also adds a speculative element, a little bit of science fiction, horror, or fantasy. And just to kind of think about how the anthology reads, it's like Tom Clancy meets Stephen King or H.P. Lovecraft for those who are into that sort of thing.
Oh, nice. I'm a veteran myself, so it's always good to have another vet. What branch did you say you were?
So I was armor. So it's actually
Army.
military intelligence branch detail armor, but I never did anything in the army related to military intelligence, other than just learned exactly how the Russians fought. But that's about it.
That's okay. I was infantry, and I never actually had to do direct combat. So,
I didn't
uh,
either. I was both fortunate and unfortunate. So it's a good experience to have, but it's also some people don't come back. So
yeah. Well, I mostly consider myself fortunate not to have ever had to have the misfortune of killing somebody or I did what they asked me to do. I deployed on a peacekeeping mission, so I'm proud of my service, but I'm glad not to have had to do that. So,
and
and
where
it
where
and
did you where did you deploy?
I actually went to Egypt in 2011.
Okay,
So for the
they
uh, the MFO mission, basically.
okay, cool. That must have been
Yep.
pretty interesting. Actually, that was during the Arab Spring, right?
Yeah, it was right after the fall of Mubarak. I showed up a couple months after that. So it was still a little. I mean, we definitely had our tense moments. It was a lawless country basically at that point, especially on the roads. I got very good at defensive driving. Let's put it that way.
Oh wow!
So,
And then what unit were you with?
I was with the 175th Maryland National Guard at the
Okay,
time. So I was a National Guardsman, Florida, Maryland. So good
cool.
stuff. Good times. But you're coming on today. We're gonna talk about China. So um, I know obviously conservative sentiment has recently um, taken quite a turn against China. A couple of years ago, not that long ago, before Trump, they weren't such a boogeyman. We were all about the free trade and whatnot. Our politicians didn't have any issues, sending all of our manufacturing over there.
Hmm.
Obviously, attitudes have changed in light of the aftermath of COVID-19 and whatnot. But from your perspective, what is the main threat that China poses towards the United States?
Well, I mean, there are a number of dimensions of that threat, and the issue with China is that our economic and financial systems are so interwoven that anything that we do to them or they do to us has economic consequences to either side. So, to give you a sense of kind of different areas of these interactions, if you look at the electronics industry, about half of electronics products are produced in China, primarily in a city called Shenzhen. So there's significant economic power they have from that standpoint. They also own about 4% of U.S. Treasuries. So if they were to flood U.S. Treasuries under the market, would cause our interest rates to spike, right, which would increase the the cost of everything, and also could help lurch an economy into a recession or a depression. That said, if the Chinese do that, it has an impact on our currency, and it makes their currency stronger relative to ours, which means that we can pay for import less. By importing less, that puts pressure on their internal economy. I think the threat that the Chinese have from us, or the one thing that they're most concerned about, is that they care about stability, internal stability above all else. And with the one-child policy, by some estimates, and it's been a while since I looked at this figure, so I might be a little bit off, but they have roughly 30 million excess males. And there's been a history in China, throughout, as for 2,000 years. Whenever they have these excess males, there's always some sort of peasant revolt or revolt in the country, and that's the thing that any regime cares about above all else is maintaining power, maintaining, in China's parlance, the mandate of heaven. And anything that slows down their economy or reduces economic output is what is a serious threat to China. Where we're probably most vulnerable. So stepping back, if you look at the economic linkage, our supply chain is probably is heavily leveraged to China. That's been changing in the advent of COVID over the past few months, but it's going to take some more time than that. But where they can hurt us the most is they're pretty buttoned down in terms of from a cyber standpoint, but we're an extremely open society, and that's kind of where our Achilles heel is, our biggest vulnerability. Now, the issue with cyber is, most governments are still figuring it out, because cyber can quickly go from the digital domain to the kinetic domain. Primary example of that, or the first big example of that we saw, was the Stuxnet virus in Iran, where someone infected some Siemens SCADA systems, causing that in turn caused the cyclotrons to cycle too fast, and then destroyed thousands of them, kind of slowing down the Iran's nuclear program. So the risk there is both sides calibrating how far to push, but not too far. So as an example, let's imagine that we were stupid enough to send hack into some system on the Three Gorges Dam and bust the dam, killing tens of millions of people. That would be the response to that, or the probable response to that, from China's perspective, would very, very likely be some sort of a nuclear response. So we have to calibrate these things. And the same thing with, let's say that the Chinese try to take out, one of the major power grids in the U.S. and shut us off for a long period of time. That could also potentially trigger something that was in the nuclear domain. So I think that's probably the place where we're most vulnerable. Where the Chinese are most vulnerable to our ability to shape things would be the Strait of Malacca. Now, the Chinese import something on the order of 70% of their oil supply, and most of it goes through the Strait of Malacca. Now, the Chinese are looking at a number of policies to get their diversify their oil supply, to get it from other places. There are several other straits in that region, that kind of South China Sea vicinity, where the Chinese can route their oil shipments around the Strait of Malacca. But I don't know who did the estimate. There's an estimate that it would cost them anywhere between $84 and $220 billion a year to do that. They're also exploring some sort of a pipeline through Pakistan and there's a deep water port in Pakistan that they can get their supplies from the Middle East through that port, but it's still years away. But the Chinese are definitely moving toward it. The risk though is every time that China over the past few decades has been trying to take control over strategic industries, and at times when they have leverage, they have shown their willingness to use that leverage. So, as an example, we can talk about rare earth elements, right? And rare earth elements are 17 key metals that are used in a variety of applications, from your cell phone, from high power magnets, to defense applications like night vision, um, to green technologies like wind turbines, and batteries for electric vehicles and hybrids. So the Western society is extremely vulnerable to those things. So what the Chinese did, at least in kind of the 2010 2011, is they took control, or they were responsible for about 95% of global production of rare earth metals. And what they did is they suddenly restricted export of those materials so they could build up backlog for their own, or reserve for their own economy. And as a result, prices went up something like 8 to 10 fold in a period of 1 year. And as a result, that really spurred other countries and governments into looking very seriously at diversifying that supply. So there's a number of other areas like the electronic supply chain where we're also vulnerable. We saw it with COVID when we were trying to get key PPE, and China suddenly shut off some of their supplies so they could advantage their own domestic population. And it's not that China is evil. It's just that their priority is keeping domestic stability above all else. And if that means breaking the rules in order to prevent any civil unrest, then that's exactly what they're going to do. They're also, at least in recent weeks, there's also been they've had a ton of spying operations in the U.S. And now what they're threatening to do is detain U.S. citizens for whatever reason, in order to get us to back off from that policy. They also routinely ignore international law when it comes to their buildup in the South China Sea. And that South China Sea buildup, of course, is directly related to protecting access to the Strait of Malacca and their critical strategic supplies of oil and energy products.
Yeah, didn't the whole detaining U.S. citizen things? Didn't they basically say that we can detain anyone in the world?
Yeah.
How would that even work? Well, I mean, what would I do other than laugh if one of them tried to detain me?
Well,
here?
it's over there, right? So if you're doing business in China, like there's like what's the U.S. government going to do if they, what I mean? Like they just pull you into a room and then make up some charge, trump up some charge, and the government can try to get to you through diplomatic channels, but you're in a it's tough to enforce that, and it kind of results in a bit of a tit for a tat. The other place that I didn't even mention is what's going on in Galwan Valley in India. So back in June, there's in the foothills of the Himalaya, there's a disputed area called the Line of Actual Control, and the Indians and the Chinese have certain agreements that they can't carry certain types of weapons and things like that into that area. So there was an incident where about 20 Indian soldiers died, and according to the Indians, because the Chinese wouldn't report their numbers, I think that the official Chinese response was that we don't want to embarrass the Indians, so we're not going to report our casualties. But the Indians say it was like 50, and from the Chinese response, they immediately started dispatching martial arts experts and things like that, because it was the altercation was physical, right? The Chinese had wrapped clubs and barbed wire, and were throwing people off of into ravines of into water that at sub-zero temperature up in the foothills of the Himalayas. So like right now things are extremely tense between the Chinese and the Indians, and because the Chinese have kind of constantly been retrading. Like they come a little bit south, and then they take a little bit more territory, violate a few more agreements, and just to see what happens. And for the Indians are kind of starting to push back a little bit. So there's a lot of flashpoints right now. And then, of course, you have in Xinjiang province, where you have Uyghur populations that, I think there was one estimate that if you look at just normal population models, the growth rate of the Uyghur population has, is down by 84%, because of, the Chinese are enforcing this bit of a one child policy in the area, where they're forcibly installing IUD, birth control things, and forcibly aborting children, things like that, in order to curb the population. And they have massive internment camps in that region. So it's a pretty interesting set of times that we're living in when it comes to China.
Can't they just send them to the U.S. to open up spas? Yeah.
Exactly. Who knows? Well, or send them into Afghanistan, right? Where where U.S. troops have may or may not have encountered them as insurgents, so to speak. Same thing with Chechens. But anyway, that's another day, another story.
Amelia, she says, "What did I miss? I think you popped on about 5 minutes late. You're good." Then Ray, the musician, the Indian soldiers dying was barely reported in the U.S. That is true.
Yeah.
It didn't get much play anywhere except for Epic Times, I think.
Yeah, I think there was a brief mention of it in, at least I saw a brief mention of it in the Washington Post. But in order to get any detail on it, I had to read the Times of India in order to kind of get a good sense of what was going on. So because for something that monumental, you have two countries with more than 1 billion people each, and both nuclear powers, three nuclear powers in that neighborhood, if you include Pakistan, and it was barely mentioned in the U.S. press. That should be front page news. 20 years ago, it would have been on the front page of the newspaper.
Yeah, well, Ray here makes a good point. Epic Times, if you do want to get Chinese news, they are pretty much loaded with articles on China. So if you subscribe, I actually get their real newspaper sent to my house once a week, because I just can't stand internet reading. It's just not my thing. I need paper, but they do a good job of covering China. So
yeah, I'm a big fan of physical books for the same reason.
Yeah, I like newspapers. I just don't like many of the actual news outlets. But Epic Times is a good one if you want to support a good media company. So yeah, do you know anything? I do know that China basically colonized Africa at this point for the mineral trading. Do you know anything about that? Or
yeah, it's a lot of it is related to it solves a number of problems for the Chinese. It solves the most important part is making sure that they are able to secure access to key mineral resources, etc. It also solves that excess mail problem, right? Where you can send all your excess mails to Africa to exploit resources there, and keep them out of domestic issues. So I've one of my friends is was a private military contractor, and he said that in China, even in like pipelines in Sudan, they had soldiers guarding oil pipelines and things like that as early as the early 2000s. So it's something that's been developing for a very long period of time. The other aspect of it that's also somewhat interesting is when a U.S. or European multinational company goes into one of these countries to extract resources, even when colonialists did it, they typically employed the local population in order to extract those resources. So while they weren't great, it wasn't at least local population got something out of it. When the Chinese do it, they just bring in the Chinese, they extract the resources, and then they either maintain a security presence there, or they just take what they needed and leave. So it's a bit of a different dynamic. But Africa is certainly a future area for great power competition between the United States and China in the future, particularly where certain resources are. So as an example, with the Congo, cobalt. I think there's like 60% of the world's cobalt resources are there, and I think China processes about 80% of it. So it's something that we need to be keeping very close attention to.
Yeah, it's very fascinating. I guess we could just give Africa to China and then let all the Africans migrate to Europe. So, solid plan, right?
Yeah, it's probably not. Yeah, not really doable. But
Um, yeah, so our tensions with China, are they, would you say that they're kind of comparable to what was happening with the Soviet Union in the Cold War? If so, how? And in what ways would it be different?
yeah, so I think the paradigm that most security circles use for the the competition and how it'll evolve between the U.S. and China is the Athens versus Sparta example, which ultimately led to the Peloponnesian Wars. But the way that was, and at the time, I mean, it's not a direct analog, but it's close enough. At the time, Sparta was the dominant power. Now they were very militaristic. Less, not a democracy, which is, a little bit more like China, but we are the existing dominant superpower today. So in that sort of scenario, we're kind of akin to Sparta, whereas Athens, which is the great democracy of the time, rose in relation to Sparta, and it led to the Peloponnesian Wars, where the two ultimately had a conflict. So Athens, in that sense, was the emergent power, where China is. Now, going back to the Soviet Union, the key difference between the Soviet Union and China, and this is not a 100% black and white comparison, because there was still some trade between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, but we're not as economically linked, or we weren't as economically linked to the Soviet Union as we are to the Chinese. Additionally, just the relative size of the two economies. China is much closer to parity than the Soviet Union, I think, ever was. So, as an example, I think the U.S. economy is tracking to be around $21 trillion of GDP. The Chinese are, kind of roughly 14 trillion, and rapidly catching up. In terms of just the sheer scale of the population, I think the Soviet Union and the United States were kind of closer in size, whereas the U.S. population is roughly 330 million today. The Chinese population is 1.394 billion, something like that. So roughly over 4 times the size that we are, and I think the other difference is that the Soviets were a little bit better at power projection than the Chinese are, but that could rapidly change. And I think that the Chinese are probably becoming a much more capable competitor. I mean, the Soviets were certainly a lot more capable when it came to exclusively military power, but the Chinese, while probably not as strong militarily, if you combine that with their capabilities, or their economic capabilities, and then their just demographic size and the size of their market, it makes it a much more challenging adversary if we choose to go that way. And the good thing and the bad thing about the Chinese is that, as I mentioned earlier, we're so economically interlinked that any conflict would hurt both of us a great deal from an economic standpoint. So it'll probably evolve. I think, like you said at the very beginning of the call, into more of a kind of a neo Cold War between the two. And it's and the way China seems to behave is they'll follow the rules if you have a if there's a power disparity where you have more power, relative power than they do, but they'll ignore the rules when when it suits them and when they have leverage. That's where it gets a little bit dicey from from our standpoint.
Interesting. You kind of hit on this a little bit, but I think it'd be interesting to clarify. Who do you think that they are a greater threat to us than the Soviet Union ever was?
It's difficult to say, right? The Soviets had enough nuclear capability, and as did we, to destroy the world several times over. The Chinese don't have that, kind of nuclear overmatch, or that don't represent kind of an existential threat like that. So I would say the Soviets were probably, in hindsight, a greater threat. But that doesn't mean that the Chinese can emerge into something, that could be pretty dangerous. And look, I can think of several, because I'm a science fiction writer, so I can think of several extremely terrifying scenarios where they could. As an example, let's take the use of CRISPR technology, which is kind of a gene editing technique. We're getting to the point where you can, and I think the technology exists today. Let's say I'm an Islamic fundamentalist and I want to, or not even that. Let's just say I want to create a virus that targets everyone except for, Han Chinese. The technology exists today to do that. There's a gene called the XPA gene that you can make a tweak to, and somehow you could seed it into a population where if you go outside, your skin blisters in the sunlight, and you can target that such that is tailored to this XPA gene, which there's a gene called I think it's called the EDAR gene that 93% of Han Chinese have, and they would not be affected by this particular disease. I think it's called X pigmentosum or something like that. But it's a condition that you can cause based on a using that gene editing technique to create a virus that infects you're all Europeans, all Africans, and most East Asians would be unaffected by it. And that's just one example of different things that you can kind of come up with in your head. The other thing too is there's really no there's really no they're only just beginning to develop rules around the use of CRISPR. So let's say if I really take my speculative fiction, put my speculative fiction hat on, let's say the Chinese start to experiment with genes of children and create super soldiers, right? 10 years, 20 years from now, and create people who are twice as intelligent and things like that. By the time we figured that out, it's too late. So the only way you can kind of get up to that is if you try to use cybernetic technology and try to do what Elon Musk has been kind of talking about, is kind of learning to augment yourself to adapt and use the advances of artificial intelligence to improve your own intelligence. So anyway, that's a extreme kind of frightening scenario. But there's a conference called the DEF CON conference where the chief medical officer of Intel spoke about the dangers of CRISPR and things like that. And that's kind of one of the examples that he talked about. It's on the internet. You can watch it. It's pretty straightforward.
Yeah, I think Elon Musk is basically, he seems to think that we need to merge with machine interfaces to compete with AI, not necessarily China, but
yeah, but again, it's both are frightening possibilities.
Yeah, crazy. I'm not a big fan of the whole transhuman stuff, but anyways, our elites seem to be. And speaking of them, they also seem to be somewhat cozy with China. they also seem to have this fancy like dystopian surveillance methods against us. Now in China, we see some of that going on. Can you kind of get into what they're doing over there, what they're employing against their populace, and is that like a preview of what we might see here?
So they, as you know, they have this great firewall, and they can prevent their population from seeing what's going on. I think there are some exceptions to that rule. I don't know if those exceptions have been cracked down on yet, given in light of what's happened in Hong Kong this year. But Hong Kong used to be kind of exempt from some of that stuff. But they've also implemented a social credit system, right, where your behavior's logged, and I think there was a Black Mirror episode that showed something like that happening in the UK, where your reputation was everything, and you couldn't travel, you couldn't do all sorts of things if your social rating, your social credit score was too low, if you had a criminal record, anything like that. So they're doing I would say terrifying things like that. I would say in the U.S., I think we're doing it to ourselves, right? Sign up for this to give away your information for that, and even if you don't wouldn't ordinarily buy a product or things like that, these machine learning algorithms are learning how to also influence your behavior so that you do. What my worry is that we're just going to voluntarily do it to ourselves. The other thing too is when you have these massive social media monopolies, like in search algorithms, it's probably not necessarily a monopoly for Google, but for all intents and purposes, it pretty much is. Whenever you do a search, right, Google is kind of the go-to there. Those algorithms are made by people, and they can be manipulated, and they can steer you towards sources that you don't want to that somebody on high doesn't want you to read. Same thing with Facebook and Twitter. You look at the New York Post example, where they just wouldn't allow that information or that article to be disseminated. And my view is just let people be able to decide what information they can consume and not. We don't need somebody as a not a tastemaker is not the right word, but as an arbiter of what information is good or is not. Like let people just decide based on the facts and the information. And what's scary about that is, like, this is actually nothing new. It's just the game is the same. The weapons are different. So back in the 50s, in the 60s, when you had three major stations, it was much easier to kind of dictate what the narrative was, and you didn't have the capability to have different information sources. Whereas the result of the internet, the emergence of the internet, is that those sources were effectively atomized and broken into thousands of little pieces, where you could, one person could make a splash in terms of breaking information and things like that. But it also became difficult to control, and to validate whether or not that information was correct. Now, what that does is it makes a society, an open society like ours, extremely vulnerable to manipulation, not only by our own government, but also by outsiders like the Chinese and the Russians, in terms of dividing the U.S. population and just sowing chaos. And anybody on kind of either side of the aisle that believes that the Chinese or the Russians really care who wins. I think what they actually care about is how much chaos can they sow, so that whichever side is on the losing side of that, is there's just lots more civil unrest. Like, that's a win for India, and for Russia, and that's a win for China. So, but what's scary though is there's some emerging technologies that are going to make things even more difficult to handle and process, and that's kind of the deep fake technologies, right? Where you can have somebody say something or appear to do something, and it's just not true. And as the old adage goes, the a lie can travel halfway around the world before the truth puts its pants on. So there's a lot of potential for corruption and and control. So and it also makes it very easy, given all the information that we freely provided to these social media um, corporations that can be used weaponized against us.
Yes. Speaking of sowing chaos, I've heard speculation, but never any kind of actual evidence of China funding groups like various communist group or radical leftist groups in the United States. Perhaps some involvement with Antifa too. Do you know anything about that?
I don't know. I don't know of any specific examples, but I wouldn't be surprised if they were supplying both left and right. It would totally fit within their MO. I think there's actually a California state senator a few years ago who was extremely anti Second Amendment, but he was caught in an FBI sting operation, by supplying rifles to like AK-47 type equipment, things like that, to criminal gangs in San Francisco. So I would not be shocked if the Chinese didn't have ties there. I used to, when I worked in downtown San Francisco, I used to look down on, I was in a on a tall floor on a large building, and if you look down toward Chinatown and you looked at some of the buildings, they didn't have American flags up; they had Chinese communist flags just openly flying. And this was maybe over a decade ago. So they've definitely. I would be surprised if they haven't infiltrated some of these organizations in order to stoke chaos and unrest. I mean, it makes sense. I mean, if I, I'm sure we do the same thing to opposition in Hong Kong and things like that. Look, I'm a former military officer, and that's if your enemy does it to you, you do it to them. It's part of the nature of the game.
Yeah, we have some questions from the audience. Sam, is it true that China is militarizing and mining the Tibetan plateau, and what does that mean for surrounding countries like India?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, that's particularly with the Galwan Valley incident. They're pushing more troops down to that region. They're reinforcing, and if you read kind of Indian news, you can get a lot more detail on that. Now, the Indians in response are also pushing forces toward the border, and reinforcing that the Tibetan plateau in order to prepare for a potential conflict there. Even my understanding is that when I mentioned earlier, I think the Indians mentioned the Chinese had lost 40 to 50 soldiers to their 20, and I think again, this is me reading into some of the information sources that I've looked at, so it's my opinion. But my opinion is that the Chinese appeared to have been alarmed at the performance of their military, which was not great. And to be fair, the Indians have been have had lots of experience in Jammu, Kashmir, things like that. Whereas the Chinese not so much, right? It's not hard to herd defenseless people into internment camps, right? It doesn't require a lot of military skill and expertise. So as a result, they were rushing down martial arts experts and things like that in order to train the troops, which had kind of a didn't acquit themselves entirely in a great matter against the Indians.
Yeah, this is interesting. Somebody put a link. Black Lives Matter founder, leading initiative funded pro-Chinese. Apparently, there was some pro-Chinese group funding involved in all that, which not shocking.
Yeah,
Um,
I wouldn't be surprised by that.
yeah, Amelia Campbell. What resources would you suggest to separate personal speculations in the media and realistic possibilities that stick more with facts? Books, news stations, etc.
The one news source that I prefer to use is The Economist, particularly for U.S. domestic political news. Anything in the United States, U.S. media is just it's all narrative focused. It's designed for clickbait and things like that. Whereas it's kind of it comes at you immediately. Whereas The Economist is a British newspaper. It comes out once a week. And anytime that they have an opinion, they say, they have like a leaders section, and like it's very clear that that's, this is our opinion. And then everything else is written in such a way that it's facts and figures. It's not perfect, but it's the best source that I've seen. When it comes to other things that happen around the world, I try to go to as direct a source as I can. So, I'll give you an example. So, if I have a friend, there's a lot of stuff going on in, between Azerbaijan and Armenia right now. The Azerbaijanis are, advancing into this, this kind of not breakaway republic, but I can't pronounce it because anyway, it's a contested region between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and there's a heavy Armenian population there, and the Azerbaijanis are just shelling. There's some Turkish influence. The Turks are bringing in Syrians to fight against the Armenians. The Armenians, unfortunately, are on the have historically been tied to Russia. The French, who are a member of NATO, are kind of neutral, but they're kind of have closer ties in this situation to Armenia. So you have two members of NATO who are on opposite sides of a conflict. In kind of the Near East, kind of Central Asia area. So, and again, you hear very little about it in the U.S. media. So what I try to do is I'll look at sources like The Economist, and then I will kind of skim U.S. sources, and I'll look at something as on the left, like the New York Times, and I'll look at something that's slightly right, like the Washington Journal, or sorry, the Wall Street Journal. And then I'll look at other little bit more right-leaning sites like the Washington Times. And then I'll look at MSNBC, and anything that is common in all of those reports is probably true. Anything that is kind of wildly different, it's probably false. So it's not always the case. And then anytime I know somebody who has access to direct news sources in the region, I'll talk to directly. So I have a friend who watches Armenian news, speaks fluent Russian, and I just call him and say, what the heck's going on? And usually 90% of the time you'll get a better read on what's actually happening than you will from just watching journalists who are just trying to meet a deadline and write a story and don't really have any personal stake in the situation.
Yeah, well, AP style.
Yeah,
Pretty much
yeah,
all the legacy media sucks, and the AP sucks too. But
yeah,
what they do is they pack all the like the actual facts. You'll get pretty quickly. They're in the first paragraph, and then the rest of it is just basically opinion presented as facts and speculate
yeah.
like and then at the end is where they really throw their opinion, like at the end. You get their little zinger to end the article. But yeah, that's pretty much how they write.
And then you just have to ignore the headline too, because the editor will just put something in there that's completely not false, but like really flirts with falsehood to get people to read it. And then you read it and it's got it technically has the headline's technically accurate, but it's not what you thought it was based on your initial read of the headline.
Clickbait. That's you know, it is what it
Yeah,
is. But I think checking out the alternative media sources is pretty good. I mean, just remember everybody has there's no such thing as objective news anymore. It's
right.
just it does not exist, and I don't think it ever has, to be honest.
Yeah,
the
yeah,
news,
yeah. I don't think it ever has either. It's just, I mean, even in what you choose to report, you have to make a subjective judgment, right? So you see things that could be cataclysmic, and really noteworthy events are barely covered in our media, right? So we talk about the Gowan Valley incident. We talk about what's going on in two members of NATO potentially on two different sides of a conflict where Russia's involved, right? Like it's pretty important, right? But most people don't even know that Armenia and Azerbaijan are potentially. I mean, the Armenians are not officially involved, but there are Armenians living in that republic that are just churches are being bombed. The Azerbaijanis, like it's like the whole. If you look at everybody in the government, they all have the same last name because it's they're all nepotism. It's all a bunch of nepotism, things like that. So it's the fact that we are not covering it or talking about it is it's a shame. But I don't think anything was ever objective. I think it's just gotten significantly worse in recent years, given what's happened to business models in the media.
yeah, I think it's also gotten a lot more obvious, just kind of by circumstance. I think, um, especially with our political climate, has kind of exposed a lot of things as well. So, um,
Yeah, and the other thing too is that there's usually a story behind those stories that you'll never know about, right? So like nobody seeks to be evil, right? There's just sometimes there's something happens and you're just seeing the surface of the tip of the iceberg. But if you were to delve what's really going on, you might expose some operations that our government might have been involved in that we don't want our adversaries knowing about. So some of this stuff might be there's a lot of things that are beneath the surface. I'll give you an example. So there's a book, I think it's called Saddam's Bomb Maker. It was written by Kadir Hamza. He's a Iraqi nuclear scientist. And as a result, a lot of Western intelligence agencies were obviously looking for him, and they couldn't find him. So, on one run of the mill day, he's reported dead in the media. And as a result, he says, "No, no, 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 I'm right here. I'm in Libya right now." And it's if I were a cynical person, right? If you want to find a high value target, you have some relation. You're an intelligence operative, and you have some relationships in the media. You give them a lot of good, juicy stuff, and then every now and then they do you a favor, right? And the favor is, hey, I just need you to heard a rumor. I don't really know if it's legit, but heard a rumor this guy's dead. I'm gonna share this for you. Nobody else gets it. It's your scoop. Do what you want with it. And then they report this guy dead, and he's not dead, but a certain intelligence agency finds out where he is. So there's a lot of that stuff that's going on beneath the surface. There's also there's certain national security prescriptions that sometimes you just have to issue a press wide blackout so that they can't report it because lives could be in the balance. So there's a lot of stuff like that that goes beneath the surface that it's even tougher to see when we have all this noise in in our in the back and forth of the media narrative. So and then of course you have the people who want to drive specific messages to advantage the candidate to win a national election. And they're just people, that's their jobs. Like they have to do that, right? So it just makes it tough to suss out what is fact and what is fiction.
yeah, yeah. Um, hmm. Ray, the musician, says, like withholding information was what China tried to do with the COVID virus.
What I still is unfathomable to me is the Chinese are still reporting that they only had 5,000 COVID deaths. I mean, it's just like, come on, like, come on. Like, it's just they have a population of 1.4 billion people. right? Wuhan is, a city of tens of millions of people, and they only lost 5,000 or fewer than 5,000, and we lost over, 200,000 by this point. I don't believe it. I just don't.
It's just the flu, though, bro. It's just the flu.
Yeah, regardless though, like it should be, the death toll should be like, I've heard informally that it's from folks who've done business over there, that it's in the hundreds of thousands, right? But just
Yeah. Which is
it
still a
just
pretty low fatality rate, but they
yeah. I mean, like, as an example, 480,000 people in the U.S. die from the direct or indirect causes of smoking, right? Um, so I mean, it's not a good virus, right? It's not. A lot of good people have lost their lives to it, and it's serious. But did we have to shut down the economy like we did? I think probably a better response in hindsight would have been do something similar to what the Swedes did, right? Where you for populations that are susceptible to it, and you can look at the data, right? If you're over 75, it's like 13x or something crazy. You're the probability um, that you die from it. I think what you do is you just have you tell people, we as a recommendation, you need to quarantine if you have these sorts of factors. Um, you can't really enforce it, but you know, uh, just have something that's a little bit sounder. But just telling people, eh, eh, being wishy-washy with masks, like you should wear masks, no, you shouldn't wear masks. You can't go to funerals, but you can protest. Like, it's just uh, you undermine your credibility at all levels. And this is something that at the local level it wasn't done well. At the national level it wasn't done well. If you have a mask shortage, tell people you have a mask shortage. Don't tell people not to wear masks and then 2 months later tell them to wear masks. Like, it, if you've ever seen that show on HBO about Chernobyl, right? It's like the whole theme of the show, right? You know if you lie, you're going to undermine your ability to control a crisis, as it evolves. So you should be, if you have to communicate a difficult message, and then be done with it, and then live with the consequences. But I'm sure that some officials, when they said don't wear masks, they were worried about having a critical PPE shortage, and they didn't want people to go to the stores and run them up. Now, is a mask going to stop you from getting infected? No, probably not. Will it reduce the probability you get infected or reduce your viral load? Sure. So, like, it just there was too much, not enough common sense. And I've been to a number of places since this thing broke out, and I've seen a variety of responses, right? So where I live, which is in Northern California, it's like, people are like, walk around like they're self-appointed despots, right? Just like, you outside, right? Everybody knows UV light, kills this thing. You could be 20 feet away from somebody, and when you're hiking, you need to respirate. You need air. And like when I hike, I don't wear a mask outside, right? I just avoid people, and people will approach you and, like, these little petty dictators, and try to tell you what you do. And it's just like, you just politely said, mind your own business. I'm 20 feet away from you. You're fine. You're okay. Whereas, like, in other parts of the country, I flew back from the East Coast, and it was a guy from China sitting next to me on a flight, and his father was wearing a mask. I was wearing a mask because we were pretty tight quarters, and this guy was like wearing his mask like it was a goatee, right around his chin, and it's just like, what's wrong with you, buddy? Like, this is the time to wear it. So there's not a lot of common sense, and there's not in enforcement. Yeah, it's been an interesting time. I think they were trying to pass a bill where if you left California up to 10 years ago, they could still tax you. Good luck with that.
Well, I guess in conclusion, how do you see the whole China thing playing out? What scenarios can you see happening?
So, I mean, the best part about this, COVID crisis is it woke up a lot of U.S. multinationals. And as a result, I expect them to start. I mean, they already have, but they're gonna diversify their supply chain so it's not as reliant on China. I think the next kind of big break point is going to be dependent on the result of the U.S. election. I think the Trump administration will continue to be tough on China, and I'm not taking a stance either way, right? I think they'll continue to be tough, and I think that's consistent. That's good. I think a Biden administration would be a little bit more conciliatory, for better or for worse. And then I think Russia is, to put things in the perspective, I would say that Putin with a very bad hand is playing like a maestro. He, the Russian GDP is actually, I've been saying that it was about the same size as Italy's. It's not, it's smaller. So they have a smaller GDP than Italy, but for some reason they're the big bugbear of the the U.S. media right now. And to be fair, they are extremely good with information warfare and cyber war, things like that. They're very skilled at that. That said, our population is just more exposed, given how advanced our economy is than anybody else. So that's what makes us vulnerable. So I think a Trump administration will continue to be what it actually has been, which is measured against Russia. So I get public comments that President Trump has made in relation to Russia, but when push comes to shove, we've actually been fairly measured. And I'll give you an example. So in I think February 2018, and again this was barely reported, but it was reported. There was a private military corporation called the Wagner Group that had something like 200 soldiers and a bunch of like a column of tanks and armored personnel carriers in Syria, and they were approaching a U.S. FOB or operating base in Syria, and at the highest levels, our government called the Russians and said, "Hey, we have a convoy heading our way. If they get any closer or they start attacking us, we will wipe them out." And the Russians said, "No, it's that we don't know what it is. It's fine, right?" So anything that happens in Russia or that the Wagner Group does, Putin knows. Putin knows what's going on. So it's like, okay, you guys don't know. So they I think began an attack, and we brought in some Apaches, some artillery and drones, and wiped them out. So there were 200 Russian nationals that U.S. government killed. But you never hear about that in the mainstream media, but you can find it. Just do a search. So I think we've been pretty measured. I think a Biden administration might take a harder tack against the Russians, just solely because that's what they've been pointing to for the past 4 years as a big thing, after making fun of Mitt Romney for calling the Russians a threat or a major threat. Right? Suddenly they became this big bugbear. And at the end of the day, I think they were right to. I mean, I shouldn't say they were right to laugh at Romney, but like the level of that our media has created this. First it was not a threat, then it was a huge threat to democracy. At the end of the day, I think the Russians are a force to be reckoned with, but they are not the same existential threat that they were during the Cold War. And I think that they need to be monitored, checked, and we just need to treat them seriously. But they don't represent remotely the same level of vital national security threat that the Chinese do today.
Yeah, I think the left's attitude change on Russia has more to do with their cultural shift. Honestly,
in what sense?
Russia, took more. They took a very traditionalist, kind of a more conservative path, and I think the left kind of feels betrayed, to be honest. Um, so I mean, Putin's not like an angel, but he's definitely took more of a nationalist bent, and then the Orthodox Church has also been kind of allowed to flourish as a cultural force there, and that's just not politically correct for the mainstream media and the left. So I
Yeah,
think that's where.
I think he was
Well,
I mean, he's came from the KGB, right? Like he looks at the world the same way that somebody like I would look at the world, right? I just look at a country. I look at, what are our vital national interests? If you are running a country, your goal is to, ensure that you achieve your vital national interests at whatever cost, right? You're not, if the way that the international system is set up is not because the U.S. is such a wonderful place. It's we helped set it up after winning World War II, and I shouldn't say that because the Russians, they took the brunt of they faced 70% of the Wehrmacht, so they actually won it there. We certainly won it against Japan, but we helped shape that international system, and that international system helps us, right? It helps freedom of trade. It helped shape us into a major economic power. And as you're looking at your vital national interests, you want to make decisions that advantage you. I mean, that's your job as a leader, and that's the way that's all Putin does. And he does it. And look, he's our enemy, right? But he's doing what anyone who's intelligent would do if you had the hand that the Russians had. And that just kind of is what it is. When you kind of look at the world through these emotional lenses, it's easy to get to muddy yourself in bad decision making and bad policy making, and that's one of the advantages of having kind of unelected bureaucrats. Unfortunately, unelected bureaucrats do other things that are terrible, but in the national security infrastructure, they generally tend to be the people on the left and right tend to be on the left and right in the middle, and they tend to be, for the most part, aligned. It's just you have a lot of clowns and characters out there who know nothing about national security, spouting off their spouting off opinions about things that they don't know anything about, and it's just it is what it is.
yeah, well, we're gonna put all the permanent bureaucrats and the journalists in Guantanamo Bay. So I'm kidding.
Yeah, I
um,
don't.
but it just where can, if anybody wants to support your work or find some of your books or stories, where can they go?
Yeah, so the latest book that I have out is Weird World War III. You can find that on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, or anywhere else books are sold. It's got a lot of amazing authors in it. It's got David Drake, who's like me, is an 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment veteran. He fought in Vietnam. He's got a story in there. And also has one of Mike Resnick's last stories. So he's a multiple Hugo and Nebula award-winning author. Um, and then there's also a really good story about conflict between cosmonauts and astronauts on the moon with John Langan, who is a Bram Stoker award-winning author. So there's a lot of really good stories. It's called Weird World War III. I'm the editor. The premise is, what if the U.S. had fought the Soviet Union in World War III, and there's a speculative science fiction, fantasy, or horror element. So if you ever read any Tom Clancy, if you ever read any Stephen King, it's Tom Clancy meets Stephen King. There's 19 great stories. You should definitely check it out. My website is seanpatrickhazlett.wordpress.com. You can also find information about me and that book, as well as others.
All right. Well, I appreciate you coming on, Sean. And for those of you watching Thursday night, be sure to tune in. We are having rising star in the Ortho Brosphere, Luke Kindrat from the Orthodoxy First channel. So once again, thank you, Sean, and thank you, viewers, and we will see you Thursday night.
Thank you, Michael. It was a pleasure to be on the show.